It was supposed to be a quiet night shift, like all the others. I worked as a security guard at an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that had been abandoned for years before a tech company took it over for storage. Most nights were uneventful, just me, a few cameras, and the endless buzz of the fluorescents. But this night was different. I was sitting in the small office, watching the security monitors like I always did. The cameras were old, the grainy footage casting long, eerie shadows in the dimly lit corridors of the warehouse. At around 2 a.m., I noticed something strange on one of the feeds. A door at the far end of the building, a storage room that hadn't been used in months, was wide open. I hadn't seen anyone go in there, and it was always locked. I figured it must have been the wind or a mistake from a previous shift, so I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and keys, the heavy door to the office creaking as I stepped into the dark corridor. The silence was thick, broken only by the soft echo of my footsteps on the concrete floor. As I got closer to the storage room, the air grew colder, something that wasn't normal for this part of the building. My flashlight beam trembled slightly, more from my nerves than anything else. When I reached the room, I stood outside for a moment, staring at the open door. The room beyond was pitch black, the smell of stale air and dust thick. I called out, "Hello? Anyone in there?" My voice bounced off the walls, but there was no answer. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath me. That's when I noticed it. Handprints. Dozens of them, smeared across the walls, small, like a child's, but too faint to have been fresh. They hadn't been there the last time I checked this room. My heart raced. I turned to leave when I heard a sound behind me, a faint giggle, like a child playing. I whipped around, but no one was there. Just the empty room and those ghostly handprints. As I backed out of the room, the door slammed shut on its own. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I ran, and I never went back to that warehouse again. I used to work the night shift at an old care facility. It wasn't a high-end place, just a forgotten building for people with nowhere else to go. Most nights were quiet, just routine rounds, checking on patients and making sure everything was in order. But there was one night that still haunts me. It was around 3 a.m., the time when the place felt the most eerie. The halls were dimly lit, and the building always had this damp, musty smell that never went away. I was walking down the East Wing, which was the quietest part of the facility. It housed the older patients who mostly slept through the night, but it always gave me the creeps. The nurses used to joke that the East Wing was haunted, but I never believed them, until that night. As I passed one of the rooms, I heard a noise, soft at first, like a low murmur. I stopped, listening. It was coming from one of the patients' rooms, Mr. Hughes. He was 87, bedridden, and mostly unresponsive. I'd never heard him make a sound in all the time I worked there. But now, there was this faint whispering coming from his room. I pushed open the door slowly. The air was cold, colder than it should have been. My flashlight flickered as I shone it toward Mr. Hughes's bed. He was lying there, still as ever. But then I noticed something else. A figure, standing at the far corner of the room. It was just a shadow at first, barely visible in the darkness. But as I squinted, I could see it more clearly. A tall, thin figure, dressed in what looked like an old hospital gown, its back turned to me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I knew all the patients in that wing, and this figure didn't belong. I blinked, and it was gone. Just like that. The room was empty again, except for the still figure of Mr. Hughes. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open. He hadn't moved or spoken in months, but now, his mouth moved, barely a whisper. "She's coming for me," he rasped, his voice shaking. I bolted out of the room, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. 2 days later, Mr. Hughes passed away. No one else saw what I did that night, but I can't forget it. Something was in that room with him. Something real. I used to work the night shift at a 24-hour diner just outside of town. It was one of those places where truckers and late-night travelers stopped for a quick meal. but most nights it was empty. Just me, the hum of the fridge, and the soft glow of the neon sign outside. It was a slow night, around 3 a.m., when the front door chimed. A man walked in, but something about him immediately felt wrong. He was tall, wearing an old weathered jacket, his face hidden under a hood. His movements were slow, almost mechanical. I greeted him, but he didn't respond. He just shuffled to a booth in the back and sat down, staring straight ahead. I went over with a menu, but he didn't even look at it. Instead, he spoke, his voice low and raspy. "I've been here before, a long time ago." Chills ran down my spine. There was something familiar about his words, though I couldn't place it. I asked if he wanted coffee. No response, just silence. He kept staring forward, his hands trembling on the table. I backed away slowly, unnerved. When I turned back to the counter, I noticed something strange. The man had left wet footprints leading to his booth, but the night had been dry. My heart raced as I glanced back at the booth. It was empty. The door hadn't opened, no chime, nothing. He was just gone. I rushed over, but the only trace left was the wet footprints slowly fading into the floor. I asked my boss the next morning, and he told me no one had been in that diner for hours before I got there. To this day, I don't know who or what he was.